So I saw a video on YouTube of Read With Me for first aid. So I got inspired by that and thought it's really great idea. So today I will be reading out rapid revision of orthopedics with all of you. Okay, so Bankart's fracture, the first thing is it is injury of antero inferior or glenoid labrum. Okay, so the injury of anterior inferior or glenoid labrum of the shoulder due to repeated anterior shoulder dislocation. So this is here the Bankart's lesion, as you all can see, or you can see it very clearly in this part. Why does this a part of bone is broken on the lower part of the scapula, of the lower part of scapula? This is known as bony Bankart. Why this happens? Due to recurrent anterior shoulder dislocation or glenoid labrum injury, again and again repeated. So this is Bankart's. Then Barton's fracture. It is intra-articular fracture of the distal end of radius with dislocation of distal radio-ulnar joint. This is radius, this is ulna. Okay, so it is the intra-articular fracture of the distal end of radius along with the dislocation of this is the dislocation of the radio-ulnar joint. Okay, then we have Bennett's fracture. Now Bennett's is an oblique intra-articular two-part fracture. First is base of first metacarpal, which extends into trapezio first metacarpal joint. So we have oblique intra-articular two-part fracture of base of first metacarpal extending into trapezio first metacarpal joint. Then we have Rolando fracture. Rolando fracture is sometimes T-shape, V-shape, Y-shaped comminuted fracture through the base of first metacarpal bone extending into trapezio first metacarpal joint. Then we have Bosworth fracture at the distal fibula with an associated fixed posterior dislocation of the proximal fibular fragment, which becomes trapped behind posterior tibial tubercle. What is Bosworth? At the distal fibula. Now हम hand joint से we came to foot joint. So we are talking about fibula, and it is associated fixed posterior dislocation of proximal fibular fragment, which becomes trapped behind the posterior tibial tubercle. Then boxers. So very beautiful picture is given here for boxers. Transverse fracture of fifth metacarpal along the neck with volar angulation, and boxers is most common type of metacarpal fracture. So fifth metacarpal ka fracture along the neck, so this is the neck, and with the volar angulation, so it is coming down. Okay, so what this image says, the end of the fifth metacarpal, this is the end of the fifth metacarpal, it takes the force of impact which breaks the neck and it angulates towards the palm, and when it angulates towards the palm it creates a dorsal bump. Then we have bumper fracture, which is a fracture of the lateral tibial condyle caused by a forced valgus applied to the knee. This is fracture of lateral tibial condyle, and it is caused by forced valgus applied to the knee. Mode of injury is forced valgus of knee when struck from side by a car bumper. So we can see it in car bumper injury, knee injury, the lateral tibial condyle injury. Then we have Segon fracture, which is avulsion fracture of the lateral tibial condyle of the knee. highly significant due to an associated with ACL tear. Stira fracture, avulsion fracture, medial femoral condyle at the origin of the femoral insertion of MCL. Then we have chance fracture and Schoffer's fracture. So these two are kind of frequently asked. So what is chance fracture? This through and through fracture, you can see it is hyperflexion injury of spine which leads to transverse fracture through the posterior element of vertebra and posterior portion of the vertebral body. It is coming through and through. And where is it seen? It is seen in seat belt injury or jackknife injury. Then Schoffer's fracture, which is also known as backfire fracture or Hutchinson fracture. So earlier it was the cars had Schoffer driven, the cars were Schoffer driven. So it was seen that the styloid process used to break. The styloid process used to break. So it is an intra-articular fracture of distal end of the radius and with the avulsion of the radial styloid, which is Schoffer's. So wherever you see avulsion of radial styloid, go for Schoffer's. Wherever you see through and through fracture in vertebra, that is chance fracture seen in seat belt injury or jackknife injury. Then we have Barton's fracture. It is radiocarpal joint subluxation with intra-articular fracture of distal end of radius and intact styloid. Schoffer's fracture, intact radiocarpal joint with intra-articular fracture, distal radius and the radial styloid fragment. Chopard's fracture dislocation, dislocation of the intertarsal joint, mid-tarsal joints. Lisfranc fracture, fracture dislocation of tarsometatarsal joint, injury of foot in which one or more of the metatarsal bones are displaced from the tarsus or tarsometatarsal joint. We have Clay-Shawler fracture, which is stable fracture through the spinous process or a vertebra occurring at any of the lower cervical or upper thoracic vertebra. Colles fracture, extra-articular fracture. This is important. So you see this thing, see this thing, see this thing. Okay, over here, right here. So it is extra-articular fracture at the distal end of the radius, which leads to the dorsal displacement of the, this is dorsal displacement of the distal fragment, and it leads to most commonly finger stiffness. Other than this, it is malunion. So it is for three things about Colles. It is extra articular. Then what kind of displacement? So it is dorsal displacement. Then it is most common is finger stiffness, and if not, then malunion. Okay, then there's Smith's fracture or reverse Colles, extra-articular fracture of distal end of radius with volar anterior displacement of distal fragment. So Colles and Smith are studied together almost always because both are extra-articular fracture. This is distal end of radius, this is distal end of radius with volar displacement. Here the displacement is dorsal. That's it. So what is it? Smith has volar or anterior displacement. Colles has dorsal displacement. C with D and S with A. Have you heard of SVA? Yes, you all have heard of it. And then there is CD. So C goes with D and S goes with V or A. Okay, then we have Potts fracture, which is bimalleolar, that is medial malleolus and lateral malleolus fracture. This is medial malleolus, this is fractured, this is lateral malleolus, this is fractured bimalleolar. Okay, then we can read it, it's not that important. Essex Lopris said T fracture, fracture of head of radius with, I'm sorry if the pronunciation is wrong, it is LOPRESTI fracture. Concomitant dislocation of the distal radioulnar joint with disruption of the interosseous membrane. Interosseous membrane, this is disturbed. The expected question is this. This is expected. All are a part of triad except. So what are the parts? Disruption of interosseous membrane, comminuted displaced fracture of the radial head, subluxation of dislocation or the distal radioulnar joint. Galeazzi fracture or reverse Monteggia, Piedmont's fracture, Monteggia fracture. Galeazzi fracture, reverse Monteggia, fracture of radius at the junction of middle and distal half with distal radioulnar joint dislocation, and Monteggia is fracture of proximal 1/3 of ulna with dislocation of head of radius. So I learned it as MURGA, Murga. So it is Monteggia with ulnar dislocation and RGA, radius. Okay, I have said ulta, sorry. M with U, so Monteggia with ulna, yeah, I said that only, and GRA, Galeazzi with radius fracture. Okay. Then we have green stick fracture. What is green stick fracture? It is most common fracture in children overall. So this is important. Unicortical fracture, incomplete fractures of the forearm bones. Concavo-convex deformity, most common fracture in children around the elbow, which is supracondylar fracture humerus. It is most common fracture in children around elbow. Nightstick fracture, isolated fracture of shaft ulna without associated fracture of the radius. Mode of injury is direct trauma to the forearm while in a defensive stance. Hangman's fracture, fracture of both pedicle pars interarticularis of the axis vertebra C2. Mode of injury in Hangman's is distraction and extension of the neck. Leads to both pedicle and pars interarticularis of C2. That is seen this. This is C2 fracture, Hangman's fracture. So a question if asked ki in a case of hanging, which vertebra is involved? C2 vertebra is involved. Then heel sacs fracture is cortical depression in the posterior lateral aspect of head of humerus. Second most common cause of recurrent anterior shoulder dislocation, heel sacs. Then Halston-Lewis fracture, it is oblique. This is oblique and displaced fracture of the shaft of humerus resulting in entrapment of this radial nerve leading to the wrist drop. Then Jefferson fracture, fracture of anterior and posterior arches of the C1 vertebra due to fall from height. Jefferson C1, anterior posterior arches, anterior posterior arches due to fall from height. All fracture in Jefferson. Then we have John's fracture, fracture in the metaphysio-diaphyseal junction of base of fifth metatarsal of the foot. Okay. Then Pseudo-John's avulsion fracture of the tuberosity of the base of fifth metatarsal involving the articular margin. 3P, pseudo-proximal peroneus brevis. Tillock's Chopard's fracture, Salter Harris type 3, fracture of Chopard's tubercle, fracture through the anterolateral aspect of the distal tibial epiphysis. It is the opposite of Backstaff-Lefort fracture. Le fortis fracture, vertical fracture of the anterior medial part of the distal fibula with avulsion of anterior tibiofibular ligament opposite to Tilloch's chop part fracture. Pipkin dislocation, Pipkin fracture dislocation, posterior dislocation of hip with avulsion fracture of fragment of femoral head by the ligament teres. Mode of injury is impact to the knee with the hip flexed. Fracture is during dashboard injury. Then we have runner fracture, stress fracture at distal fibula 3 to 8 centimeter above the lateral malleolus. Mode of injury is repeated axial stress on fibula. This is lover's fracture, bilateral intraarticular calcaneal fracture. Aviator's fracture, fracture of neck of talus, talus retrograde, blood supply. Straddle fracture, bilateral fracture of superior inferior pubic rami. Toddler's fracture, spiral fracture. This is spiral fracture of distal tibia, seen in children less than 8 years due to accidental fall. What do we do? Cast childhood accidental spiral tibial fracture.